Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, a librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. Today, we are continuing our series on South Carolina's 4th Regiment during the Revolutionary War, exploring their order book, which is basically a journal of the orders they received, and it details their activities. The last time, the regiment, along with others, had taken Fort Johnson from the British, who had already abandoned it before the Americans got there, and were still in 1775 at this point, so the Declaration of Independence had not yet been signed and made official. But just as a note, to distinguish between the two groups, I am referring to those soldiers fighting for independence as Americans, and those on the other side as British, of course. One other note is that we won't be going day by day every single day in this order book because on a lot of days, nothing happened or the exact same thing happened that had happened the day before. But before we dive into the order book, let's talk about what's going on at the South Carolina Historical Society. The Historical Society is hosting Diaries and Drinks on Thursday, June 6th, 2024, from 4:30 to 6:30. It's an exclusive exhibit of some of the most interesting diaries and journals found in our collections. Libations and light hors d'oeuvres will be offered. Tickets for members are $30 and non-members are $40, and you can get more information in the news and events section of our website, schistory.org. Now, we should take one more moment here because it occurred to me that we did not talk about the role of the 4th Regiment in the last Order Book podcast. They were an artillery regiment whose members oversaw weapons on the various forts and batteries in the Charleston area, as well as repairs to and constructions of those batteries. So they were often with other regiments, which would have been called regiments of foot at the time, basically today's infantry. And those were the soldiers who were on the ground fighting the battles. And let's talk about the sources used in today's episode. In addition to the order book itself, which is housed in our archives, I've used several other sources for this episode, which include Barnard Elliott's recruiting journal, housed at the Charleston Library Society and printed in volume 17, number 3 of the South Carolina Historical and Genealogical Magazine. Reflections of Democracy in Revolutionary South Carolina by Walter J. Frazier, Jr., Papers of the Second Council of Safety in the Revolutionary Party in South Carolina, published in the South Carolina Historical and Genealogical Magazine, Carolina.com, and Encyclopedia.com. So at this point in the order book, we're only a few days in. It's September of 1775, and we're on Fort Johnson, one of the defense lines of the Charleston Harbor. It's located on James Island, so just across that harbor from downtown Charleston. And let's head back there. 8th September, Parole Camden, countersign Lee. The officers of their respective companies to order and see that the men's barrack rooms are cleaned out every morning and the dirt carried out of the fort. 2 men out of each company, under the command of a sergeant of Captain Marion's company, to parade immediately in order to fill the quarter casks with water for use of the garrison. as a reminder, a lot of these entries start with a parole word and a countersign word, which are basically the passwords to get into the fort. They changed each day, and I can't imagine trying to keep up with these. In this entry, it seems like a pretty mundane day at the fort, but this was also the day that American troops seized a small ship leaving Charleston and taking supplies out to 2 British ships anchored near Sullivan's Island. So, a few days before, when Fort Johnson was seized, some British sailors had warned that the plan was to bring a ship full of explosives, attack the fort, and then burn the town. The British had recently done something similar in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which is a part of today's Boston. So a state of emergency was declared in Charleston and the supply ship was seized. But the ship was not carrying any supplies that would bring the destruction predicted. And this seizure led to a retaliation by the British ships Tamar and Scorpion, which blockaded Charleston and then seized a privately owned ship. So while the day on Fort Johnson was mundane, the day in the greater Charleston area was not. But let's get back to the order book. 19th September, parole ward, countersign Boston. The officer of the fort and quarter guards to order their sergeant to search all boats that come to the fort and camp, and if they find any rum in them, to bring it and the persons who own it to the commanding officer. No officer to go up to town from the fort or camp without leave from the commanding officer. 21st September, parole Gadsden, countersign Lynch. A court-martial to sit in the fort at 11 o'clock this morning to try all prisoners that may be brought before them. All evidences to attend. 1 captain of the garrison and 4 subalterns from the camp to compose the court. 1 sergeant and 10 privates from the camp to parade immediately to assist in unloading and landing timber and palmetto posts for the garrison. The sergeant to receive his orders from the commanding officers. So now we know how those in command feel about rum. They're not fans. If someone was caught with rum in their boat, they were to be brought to the commanding officer. And it's also interesting to note about the timber and palmetto posts being brought to the fort in this last entry. If you know what the South Carolina state flag looks like, it prominently features a palmetto tree. And that's because in June of 1776, a few months after this order book is being written, Colonel William Moultrie's men in a fort built out of palmetto trees repelled the British troops. It's a victory celebrated in Charleston every year as Carolina Day. Also, we see in the second entry the first instance in the order book of them putting soldiers on trial who were accused of various offenses. These courts-martial could also try civilians if they were involved in military matters. And we'll see later that these proceedings had a rotating cast of leaders. 1 officer would serve as president, and at least 2 others would be members. And these were convened quite frequently, sometimes several times a week, so you can imagine how often the soldiers were getting in trouble for things. The entries don't generally discuss who's appearing before the panel or what the verdict ends up being, but there are some exceptions to this that we'll see later, usually because the cases involve officers or because the punishment is severe. And the types of things that people were being tried for included neglect of duty, especially if they were supposed to be on guard duty, desertion, riotous behavior, gambling, threatening fellow soldiers, losing their weapons, and falling asleep while on guard duty. Oh, and the word evidences here, as in all evidences to attend, actually is their way of saying witnesses. So let's move ahead to September 23rd, 1775. General orders. Order that Pinckney's Grenadiers and Marion's Light Infantry companies do join Major Roberts' detachment on Monday next. Order that Elliott's Grenadiers do remain in the fort as cannoneers and be exercised to the use of the great guns every day. They are to be exempted from all guard duty. Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Mott to remain in the fort as commander of the whole. The present camp to be removed and formed into a line a little below the glacis, fronting the fort. Captain Pinckney's Grenadiers on the right, Captain Cattle and Marion's Light Infantry on the left, leaving small intervals between the battalion companies and them. A soldier's tent to be given to each captain who has no tent of his own, and also 1 soldier's tent to 2 subalterns who have no tents of their own. 1 tent to a company for the sergeants, 1 captain, 2 subalterns, 2 sergeants, 2 corporals with 40 private men to mount guard in the fort and to be relieved every 24 hours from the camp. Captain James McDonald to take charge of Captain Yuji's company. The outpost on the left of the tabby work to be discontinued until further orders. So that gives you an idea about the role of some of the men in the 4th Regiment. Captain Elliott's grenadiers were in charge of the cannons, and they practiced with those to the extent that they didn't have to sit guard duty like the rest of the soldiers there. The second part of this passage is interesting because it talks about tent distribution, and it shows that some of the people were bringing their own supplies. They brought their own tents. So they were just providing tents to those who didn't have them, didn't bring them with them on their soldier duty. And for those of you wondering what a subaltern is, it was a military ranking category borrowed from the British. A subaltern in the colonial army generally referred to a second lieutenant. 26th September, parole Asif, countersign Lawrence. A return to be given into the commanding officer tomorrow at orderly time of cartridges wanting to complete each man to 12 rounds. The articles against mutiny and desertion to be read by an officer of the company to his men tomorrow morning after the roll is called. So it sounds like mutiny and desertion may be becoming a problem, and perhaps that's what some of these courts-martials are dealing with. So probably to reiterate to the men and make sure they understand the rules here, the articles are read out loud to the men. 27th September, parole Rockingham, countersign Liberty. Sergeant Lloyd of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment is appointed gunner of Fort Johnson and is to be obeyed as such. A return of the 7 companies of the 1st and 2nd Regiments encamped and of Captain Elliott's grenadiers in the fort to be made to the commanding officer at orderly time tomorrow morning. 28th September, parole Virginia, countersign Santee. Ordered that no person whatever do on any account stop, molest, or detain the Negroes with the provision boat, or become passenger in her. This is a recurring theme for the next few months, that soldiers are leaving camp and going to town, not necessarily to desert, but just to make a quick trip home, which is not allowed without prior permission. It's hard for me to imagine fighting a war, or preparing for battle in this case, and being able to see your house or your friends' houses, or at least seeing people you know across the harbor. They're within sight, not far away, but you cannot go over there because the fight of your life could break out any day now, and you have to be prepared and have enough men in camp to fight. 30th September, parole Lexington, countersign Dorchester. No non-commissioned officer or soldier to go to town without leave of the commanding officer. All damaged cartridges and spare balls to be delivered to the gunner of the fort. The officers that have or may have leave of absence upon their return to camp or to the fort are desired to call on the commanding officer. The officers of the different companies are requested to be more attentive to the appearance of their men, particularly those that are for duty. A court-martial to sit this morning at 11 o'clock to try all such prisoners as may be brought before them. So again, they're getting in trouble for leaving, but they're also now getting fussed at for their appearance. And this dress code continues to come up as an issue too. Orders often include a reminder to officers to make sure that the men of their companies are well presented, especially when they're allowed leave. 4th October, parole Cambridge, countersign Shiraz. Captain Sanders to take charge of Captain Barnwell's till his return to camp. The commanding officers of companies are desired not to suffer any of their men to go to town without a permit signed by the commanding officer in the fort, who will grant them to 2 men per company every day, if necessary. Those men that are seen in town without permits will be taken up as deserters. The articles against mutiny and desertion to be read by an officer every morning at troop meeting till further orders at the head of each company. A court-martial to sit this morning at 10 o'clock to try all prisoners that may be brought before them. The evidences to be ordered to attend. Here we are, it's October now, and the men encamped at Fort Johnson are now free to visit town if granted permission by their commanding officer. But without that approval, they're considered deserters, and the punishment for that could be severe, as we'll see later. 9th October, parole Worcester, countersign Wando. A return to be made as soon as possible to the commanding officer from each company of the number of arms and pouches unfit for service, and how many bayonets are wanted. Captain Thomas Pinckney to take charge of Captain Adam McDonald's company until further orders. Orders by Colonel Moultrie dated October 8th 1775 ordered that a general court-martial be held on Thursday next, the 12th instant, at Fort Johnson. Major Roberts, president, 4 captains, and 2 subalterns from the 2nd Regiment to be members of the court-martial. Captain William Mason is appointed judge advocate to the said court. All evidences to have notice to attend. A report of the proceedings and determinations of the General Court-Martial are to be made to the Provincial Congress or to the Council of Safety in due time. Order that all officers who have not been on the recruiting service do hold themselves in readiness, as they will receive their recruiting orders very soon. A report to be made of what arms the deserters have carried off with them. This was a long entry, and unfortunately, we do not know who was appearing before this court-martial that they're convening here. It sounds like it's someone important. They have more members than usual on the court, and a report of it is ordered to be made to the Provincial Congress or the Council of Safety, which was the state's governing body at the time. Plus, it's a general court-martial, not a regimental one, so that means it could be meant for someone higher ranking. One thing that we do learn here, though, is that the soldiers of the day were assigned recruiting duty on a rotating basis. It was a real issue filling up these ranks, and by 1778, a few years from now, South Carolina would pass the Vagrant Act to enlist those without jobs or who were begging into the Army. But before then, people like Barnard Elliott traveled in July of 1775, just a few months before this order book begins, to recruit, and the soldiers themselves also went on recruiting missions, sometimes even to nearby states. When Elliott takes over the regiment in December of 1775, he writes to the Council of Safety explaining how deficient they were compared to how many soldiers were needed to operate the batteries at Fort Johnson. He said that the work to build the batteries, which were necessary for the defense of Charleston, wasn't being done quickly enough because of how few men they had doing it, and because some of those who were there weren't doing their jobs properly. He also tells the council that he slapped and hit an overseer who refused to order the men, both soldiers and enslaved, to work harder and to take necessary precautions, like securing the palmetto logs so that an incoming storm didn't wash them away into the harbor. So that gives you a sense of the kind of environment we're in here. I'm sure it's a lot of pressure. They've got this potential war going on, and they're having trouble getting men into their ranks. Some of the ones that are there don't want to be there, I can imagine, for many, many different reasons, but it's just a lot going on. 15th October, Parole Niagara, countersign 9. No gaming to be allowed among the soldiers, and the officers are desired to make examples of such as may disregard this order, which must be made known to the men. The captain of the day is requested to visit the tent where the beer is sold and examine the same, and should he find rum or any other spirituous liquor, to report the same. 19th October, Parole Quebec, countersign number 45. Major Roberts to commanding officer, Colonel Mott, on parole d'honneur. That's my really poor French there. I actually did take French for a long time. So this actual incident that is referred to here in this order book, the parole d'honneur, that's a little better, is not really extensively explained in this order book. But October 19th, it's a day after a ship leaving Fort Johnson was fired on by the British ship Tamar. In that ship was a detachment from the 2nd Regiment who were stationed at Fort Johnson, led by Isaac Mott, who was also in that ship. No one was injured in the attack, but parole d'honneur was the term for dealing with the capture of officers, essentially paroling them almost immediately, like a gentleman's agreement. So while there weren't any injuries, Mott may have been captured. We'll see what this means for his command of the fort, because there are some changes ahead about who's in charge at Fort Johnson. In just about a month, the first bloodshed in South Carolina of the Revolutionary War will happen at the Battle of 96. That's in the upstate or the backcountry of South Carolina. Our guys in Charleston won't be there, but it will have an effect on everyone fighting for independence from Britain. And in June of 1776, which we'll get to fairly quickly, the soldiers of Charleston will have to defend their city at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. We'll see you next month with a new episode, but in the meantime, you can visit our museum in the Fireproof Building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston, or our archives on the third floor of the College of Charleston's Addlestone Library. You can also visit our website at schistory.org or follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks so much for joining us.